Hey everybody. I want to go over the sixth section, which is going to be our first section looking at inequality, and we're going to be looking at inequality for the next three sections. The first one we're going to focus on is looking at social class. Now, you all have already learned the difference between structural functionalism and the conflict perspective, but this is a great time to be able to practice the differences between those perspectives and see how, as a structural functionalist, you're going to look at inequality across class differently than a conflict theorist is going to. Now, a structural functionalist member is always going to argue that we are sorted in order for society to operate efficiently. This idea that society is always trying to reach a state of equilibrium, and so a structural functionalist is going to make the argument that those who are making more money in income, those that are worth more, they're doing this because they are more talented and more qualified, and thus that's society's way of rewarding these people to get them in terms of the more important positions, important careers for the functioning of society. That a structural function is going to argue that that difference in economics is needed to attract the best candidates to the most important positions. Now, of course, it's going to be extremely flawed on a number of ways. One is it doesn't help us better understand inequality. It also doesn't help us understand how not everyone has the same access to opportunities that makes you a candidate for these higher achieving positions. For example, you may have an individual that is as every bit as capable and every bit as talented to be a high earning business person. However, if they grew up in an area that had poor schools, they didn't have the same access to resources to help them to get to college, to succeed while in school, deal with all the other life strains going on outside of school, then this individual is unlikely to get the opportunity or have the access to opportunity for this high achieving position. And so it isn't their capability that's keeping them out, it is their access to opportunities. And structural functionalism, and when looking at stratification, doesn't do a good job of helping us understand this. And that's really where the conflict perspective comes in. The conflict perspective is going to have a lot to say about stratification, about social class, about inequality. This is where you really see a lot of Karl Marx works come into play, where Marxism is really going to focus on how you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and the bourgeoisie owns the means of production, and the proletariat is the labor. And so a conflict theorist is always going to focus in and try to analyze how those who own the means of production try to exploit labor. And so a conflict theorist is going to argue that inequality is not necessary. We could have a society without inequality. However, inequality and stratification always serves to benefit those in power and those who've already accrued wealth and own the means of production. A classic example of that is we're all too familiar with how wealthy most individuals are that serve in our United States Congress. And United States, these Congress people tend to use their tendency is always to cut social programs, so programs that help the needy, people in need, in order to use that money in the budget for tax codes to help the wealthy. And the individuals that are being rewarded with this kind of legislation is themselves and also their donors and those that hang in the same social circles as them. And conflict theorists think that's going to be embedded all over our society, and that you're always going to see these individuals in power that have wealth trying to exploit labor. And then, Marx and other conflict theorists talk about this idea of a false consciousness. And that's that when those that are in the lower class actually accept the system, accept the status quo, so don't try to revolt and change. The example that I'll keep going back to that I think is a great way to think through this is that difference between the hospital CEO and the physician. Since I know a lot of you are going into medicine, the hospital CEO, they own the means of production. They own the hospital and the halls and all of the infrastructure needed in order to do the medical work. And the labor are the physicians. Now, the physicians make good money compared, to the rest of society. However, hospital CEOs make far more than physicians do. And so the question is why? Because if you just ask yourself, who are the most important pieces, who are the most important people in the hospital system, it's going to be the doctors, the nurses, all these people doing the medical work. However, the people that are paid more are the business people. These are the hospital administrators, the hospital CEOs. And a conflicts theorist would say, yeah, that is a classic example of the individuals who own the means of production, who own the hospital, run the insurance firms. They're going to exploit the labor. However, because the labor is still making a good livable salary, they are unlikely to try to revolt because they often you don't even realize that you're being exploited. Because if I'm a physician and I'm making $500,000, I think, well, life is good. Why would I question the status quo? When in reality, if you understand that, the status quo is actually exploiting me because the person I'm getting paid $500,000. So these CEOs and health insurance CEOs and other administrators can make millions of dollars, but they can't make that money without my labor. And so a conflict theorist would recognize that if labor was ever to unionize and unite and revolt against the system, we could actually boil these systems down to just who is essential. And in the medical field, who is essential are doctors, nurses, all these different medical professionals, and the patients. However, the individuals being paid the most are the least essential, but they have convinced us of their worth. And that is where functionalism is really going to be flawed. Because a functionalist would say, the person who's paid more is more important to the functioning of that institution. In reality, no. The most important person to the functioning of a hospital is the medical officials, not the CEOs. However, they have set up a system in which that feels like the case, and we rarely question this status quo. And that's how you're going to see a conflict theorist and a structural functionalist come at this differently. And that's just going to be data I want you all to look through to see actually how much more on average you're looking at these business officials versus physicians making. Now, when thinking about the United States, we have a lot of class inequality, and what I want you really to think through for this is, social class differences are embedded all throughout our society. If you walk into an airplane, you right away are hit in the face with, these individuals sitting up here that already have their alcohol, they're sitting up front, they are in a higher social class than me. We all able to see different examples of, we understand where we are in our social class and how those higher social class get prioritized in various ways. And whatever social class you exist in, it's going to have a major impact on you day to day, but also on long-term later life outcomes. For example, the higher the social class you are, the more likely you have access to broadband. There are still many people and children in our country that don't have access to Wi-Fi and broadband. Think how hard it would be, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic when we're quarantined, to try to get your schoolwork done if you didn't have access to Wi-Fi, trying to apply to college, trying to apply for jobs, work on your resume, all that kind of stuff. You didn't have access to Wi-Fi. And this is just a classic example where something that those of us that are in the middle class, upper middle class, or wealthy, we just take advantage of it. That's just a resource we have. And that's a resource we have because of our social class. And so that makes our day-to-day life easier. It also has a major impact on later life outcomes. For example, if you grow up in upper middle class or in the wealthy, if you grow up, in a higher social class, you are likely to go to better schools. You probably live in neighborhoods that have less environmental risk and exposure. You're more likely then to have access to better paying jobs because of the better schools you get to and the higher ability or higher likelihood you have of getting into college. And so and you can be absolutely 100% qualified and talented, but your access to opportunities really matter. And that's largely, you don't even realize it's invisible to you when you have these resources available to you, how your social class is making things available to you that others don't have available to them. And we often take advantage of this. And what's interesting about, we talk about social mobility in the U.S. and, it's kind of embedded in the American dream. This idea that if anybody works hard, they can move up the social ladder. In reality, in the U.S., we have some of the least amount of upward mobility in terms of social class than anywhere in the industrialized world. And it varies from area to area. And so that has led to a lot of especially modern movements questioning, well, maybe our system is flawed. Maybe our economic system is flawed because we preach this idea or this ideology of, hey, you work hard, you can move up. But in reality, that is not attainable for most Americans. And when you actually look at the data, social mobility is extremely limited in this country. Now, we use the term poverty a lot, and poverty is obviously a really important term. However, poverty looks different in terms of absolute and relative poverty. Absolute poverty is that you do not have the minimal resources and requirements you need to live in a society, whereas relative poverty is all contextual. This idea that you're in a lesser position than others in your society or majority of society, but you still have your basic needs and requirements. And whether you live in absolute poverty or relative poverty, it's a big difference in terms of your day-to-day experience and the experiences of your children. And in the U.S., we often talk about the poverty line, and this is a really important line because this is the calculation that the federal government uses to determine who lives in poverty in our country and who does not. This calculation determines who gets access to government benefits, what kind of housing assistance you can get access to, what kind of food stamps you can access to. It can dictate, if going to college, what kind of financial aid you have available to you. So the poverty line is an extremely important measure in this country. The problem is it's very antiquated. And essentially what's happened is we developed the poverty line in the 1960s in terms of what variables go into this calculation and how we're going to weigh those variables, and we haven't done much updating to it since. So for example, in 2017, for a family of four, your annual income had to be around $25,000 or less to be qualified as living in poverty. And the problem with that is when we don't adjust for inflation, when we don't adjust for cost of living standards, for example, $25,000 is going to get you a lot farther in maybe rural America than it is going to be in urban America and suburban America. And so that is really, really important because what we have is we have a lot of families right above, a lot of working class, hardworking families right above the poverty line that are being neglected government assistance, but they are still living in poverty and they need them and their children, they desperately need help. For example, if any of you live in an area, a lot of you live in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia is an extremely, extremely expensive place to live now, and it's growing fast. Just try to go ahead and ask your parents. Ask your parents, hey, what would it be like if we had to live right now on a salary of $28,000 or $30,000? Your parents would probably tell you exactly how hard it would be, the things you would have had to give up along the way, the struggles you would have faced day to day, much less year to year in that household. And that is the case for so many Americans. And part of that is, it's for a lot of reasons, but part of that is because we haven't even updated our poverty line. And, it makes you wonder why. Why? We are constantly updating our tax code. We're constantly giving more tax breaks to the wealthy. We hear all the time, how we're just, Americans are taxed too much. Well, where's the same outrage around updating the poverty line and recognizing that we have fellow Americans living in absolute desperation? Their children are growing up in, desperate situations, and yet we don't have the motivation or where we don't feel like it's a pressing need to address that. It's mind-blowing, I think, and it makes you got to question why. And a conflict theorist would say it's very intentional. Why? This is a classic example of what we continue to exploit those that are impoverished or less well off, and that those in power and those of us who don't have to worry about these day-to-day struggles and resources, we are not going to have the collective political will to address these needs. And conflict theorists, like I said, would not be surprised by it, sadly. Now, as you can imagine, growing up in poverty is going to cause all kinds of negative life outcomes, from a health standpoint. If you live in poverty, you're much more likely to have health and illness issues. That can be for a lot of different reasons. One, if you live in poverty, especially if you're right above that poverty line, you don't qualify for government medical health insurance, then you're looking at not getting preventive care, only going to the doctor when it's absolute emergency. You see children who often grow up with a lot of health issues and don't get them taken care of because of this lack of access to resources. In fact, the actual life expectancy is far different for those in the top 10% than those in the bottom percent, about a 6-year life expectancy difference. And so health looks different. Also, little things like, you might not realize it, but, when our neighborhoods, we're going to talk a lot about like racial redlining and things of that nature. If you grow up in poverty, you're more likely to grow up in an area that has more environmental risk and exposure.